Katherine Mansfield was born October 14, 1888 in Wellington, New Zealand. Although born under the name Kathleen Mansfield, Katherine wrote under the pen name of Katherine Mansfield. Born into a socially prominent family, she had two older sisters, a younger sister, and a younger brother. At the age of 5, Katherine and her family moved to Karori, New Zealand, and spent what has been described as the happiest years of her childhood. Some of the memories from this time have been used as inspiration for the Prelude story. A cellist and writer, some of her published works were featured in the High School Reporter and the Wellington Girls High School magazine. In 1903, Mansfield moved to London and attended Queen's College along with her sisters, while she continued to play the cello and contributed to her college newspaper, later becoming the editor. Mansfield did not begin to write short stories until her return to New Zealand in 1906, and it was then that she received her first payment for writing, which led to her setting her heart on becoming a professional writer. 2 years later, she headed back to London, and for the rest of her life received a £100 allowance from her father each year. Between the years of 1908 and 1910, Mansfield's personal life took numerous turns, involving an affair, a miscarriage, romantic relationships with numerous women and men, and ultimately being cut out of her mother's will. All of the events of this time had a significant effect on her literary outlook and formed the foundation for her first published collection, which she later described as immature. Mansfield later married John Middleton Murray, although they struggled financially because of his problems with Murray's magazine. Unfortunately, in 1917, Mansfield was diagnosed with tuberculosis and later took to France, where she would spend her final years until she passed away on January 9, 1923. A prolific writer in her last few years, much of her work remained unpublished until Murray took on the task of editing and publishing it into 2 additional volumes of short stories. Story's protagonist, we see the world through Laura's eyes. We observe others how she sees them, especially their responses to her own behavior. Being still a child and not fully aware of the power of class distinctions and her own place within the social structure, Laura acts as a bridge between the upper and lower classes. Laura's superficial mother who cares for clothes and exterior features only. Instead of being warm-hearted and concerned about others, she is only worried about herself and her own property and prestige. Mrs. Sheridan appreciates luxury greatly and enjoys abundance. Thus, she could not imagine living in a state of need and even demonstrates this dull attitude in a snobby manner. Mrs. Sheridan's husband and father of Laura, Laurie, Meg, and Josie. On the day of the party, he goes to work but joins the party later on that evening. The only son of the prominent family. Laurie goes to work with his father, but is featured shortly in the story. Laura's class-conscious older sister. She takes a dim view of Laura's wish to cancel the garden party when she tells Laura that she won't bring a drunken workman back to life by being sentimental. Katherine Mansfield's coming-of-age story, The Garden Party, focuses on the social and psychological discoveries of a young, well-to-do woman. The Sheridan family is preparing to host a garden party. Laura is supposed to be in charge, but has trouble with the workers who appear to know better, and her mother, Mrs. Sheridan, has ordered lilies to be delivered for the party without Laura's approval. Her sister Josie tests the piano, and then sings a song in case she is asked to do so again later. After the furniture is rearranged, they learn that their working-class neighbor, Mr. Scott, has died. While Laura believes the party should be called off, neither Josie nor the mother agree. The party is a success, and later Mrs. Sheridan decides it would be good to bring a basket full of leftovers to Mr. Scott's house. She summons Laura to do so. Laura is shown into the poor neighbor's house by Mrs. Scott's sister, then sees the widow and her late husband's corpse. She is enamored of the young man, finding him beautiful and compelling, and when she leaves to find her brother waiting for her, she is unable to complete the sentence, "Isn't life?" The garden party epitomizes the dream world of the Sheridan women. This need for the main character to be able to accept the true darkness of life is a motive typical of the Bildungsroman. It is a truth that the young hero or heroine must learn to accept in order to cross over to maturity. This is apparent in the garden party, as Laura is exposed to death and darkness outside the confines of her wealthy dream world's walls. With this exposition comes revelation and conviction. Laura asks her mother to call off the garden party out of respect for the grieving Scotts. Mrs. Sheridan places a fashionable hat she had bought for herself on Laura's head. The hat symbolizes the festive and over-the-top wealth and atmosphere of the garden party, and yet it is completely out of place at the dead man's wake later on in the story. Personification can be found throughout the story. The first example would be, the very smoke coming out of their chimneys was poverty-stricken. In this example, poverty-stricken is personifying the smoke that flows from the chimneys. The second example would be, little faint winds were playing chase in the top of the windows, out at the doors, and there were two tiny spots of sun, one on the inkpot, one on a silver photograph frame, playing too. In this example, playing personifies winds and the spots of the sun. Literary modernism is characterized by a break in traditional forms of literature, such as poetry and prose. The modernists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries experimented with the structure of their work, striving to create new styles of literature by rejecting conventional forms of expression. As a result, new and complicated writing styles were created by the modernists during this time period. Plots were no longer linear and did not always contain a beginning, middle, or end. The modernists wanted to capture the moment of a story and often began their narratives mid-action with little to no introduction to setting or background information on the characters. Stories' climaxes were reached through distracted, often fragmented storytelling with unresolved or ambiguous endings. Mansfield pioneered the modernist tendency to insert the internal musings of her characters into her stories. She is also in part responsible for modernism's preoccupation with the life-altering epiphanies of its characters. Mansfield aimed to break conventions by writing stories that were plotless, in which characters undergo a certain self-awareness with realizations that remain largely unexplained. This is certainly the case in The Garden Party. Upon leaving the party her family is hosting at their house on the hill, Laura descends to pay respects to the family of a dead workman in the slum below. Transfixed by her experience, her final statement in the story is, "Isn't life?" With this, Mansfield ends Laura's self-expression, informing us that what life was she couldn't explain. Laura has come of age in a flash, but what insight that experience produced is far from evident to the reader.